the summer of 2024 changed women's basketball forever. Not because of a championship, not because of a record broken in a box score, but because of something that happened on the court that made millions of people stop what they were doing, pull out their phones, and ask one question out loud. Did you see what they just did to Caitlin Clark? And then Stephen A. Smith walked into the studio, and everything exploded. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because to understand why that moment hit so hard, why it rippled through sports, through culture, through living rooms and barbershops and Twitter feeds and ESPN studios, you have to understand the full picture. You have to understand who Caitlin Clark is, where she came from, what she means, and why the people who were supposed to be her peers were throwing elbows, shoving her to the ground, and doing things on a basketball court that nobody could quite explain. This is not just a basketball story. This is a story about what happens when someone gets so big, so fast, that the world doesn't quite know how to handle them. It's a story about jealousy and protection and double standards, and one very loud man on television who said what a lot of people were thinking but were afraid to say. It's a story about a rookie who was supposed to be welcomed into the league, but instead walked into a storm and kept playing anyway. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, because we're going to walk through all of it, step by step, moment by moment. And by the time we're done, you're going to have a very clear picture of exactly what happened, and exactly why it mattered. Let's go back to the beginning. Caitlin Clark grew up in West Des Moines, Iowa, and if you've never been to Iowa, here's what you need to know. It is flat, it is quiet, and it is the kind of place where people take their sports seriously, because sports is one of the things that brings everyone together. Friday night lights, Saturday college games, communities built around gyms and fields and courts. Caitlin grew up in a family that loved basketball, her brothers played, her parents supported, and from the time she was old enough to hold a ball, she had something that coaches call it, that thing you can't teach, that thing that makes people stop and stare during warm-ups, that thing that makes other kids on the court go quiet and watch. She could shoot from anywhere, not just shoot, drain it, from distances that made scouts raise their eyebrows, from spots on the court that weren't supposed to be shooting spots. She had range that reminded people of players they'd only seen in the NBA, not in women's high school basketball in the Midwest. And she had confidence, not arrogance, confidence. There's a difference. Arrogance is when you think you're better than everyone and you want them to know it. Confidence is when you know what you can do and you're not afraid to do it. Caitlin Clark was confident. She'd pull up from 30 feet with a defender in her face and let it fly like it was a layup, and it would go in, and she'd point at the crowd and they'd lose their minds. By the time she was in high school, people were driving from other states to watch her play. By the time she was being recruited for college, she was one of the most watched players in the country. And she chose Iowa, the Hawkeyes. She stayed home. That decision, staying in Iowa instead of going to a powerhouse program on the coasts, that decision said everything about who she was. She wasn't chasing the spotlight. She was going to build it herself, right where she was. And that's exactly what she did. When Caitlin Clark arrived at the University of Iowa, the women's program was good but not nationally dominant. They had a great coach in Lisa Bluder, a passionate fan base and a solid program, but they weren't the team people were writing articles about. They weren't the team that was stopping people in their tracks on social media. That changed almost immediately. Caitlin didn't just play well as a freshman. She played with a style and a swagger that was unlike anything college women's basketball had seen before. She was shooting from logo range from the half-court logo almost. She was dribbling through traps like a point guard half a foot shorter than her. She was making no-look passes that made teammates laugh because they weren't expecting the ball to arrive and somehow it just was there. She was talking to the crowd. She was pointing to the rafters after big shots. She was bringing theatre to a sport that had always deserved theatre but rarely got it nationally televised. And slowly, then quickly, people started watching. The ratings for Iowa women's basketball games started climbing, then climbing more. Then something happened that nobody in the history of college sports had ever seen at that level. People started showing up at Iowa road games just to watch Caitlin Clark play. The opposing team's fans were cheering for the opponent, yes, but there was a subset of every crowd, everywhere Iowa went, that had bought a ticket specifically to see number 22 in the white away jersey. That is not normal. That is not a thing that happens. That is what they call a generational phenomenon. By her junior year, she was breaking records that had stood for decades, scoring records, assist records, records that people assumed were untouchable because the players who set them were legends. And Caitlin Clark was erasing them with a quiet efficiency that made you forget, sometimes, just how historic each moment was. By her senior year, she was the most talked about player in college sports, not women's sports, all of college sports, full stop. The Iowa women were selling out arenas, not just their home arena, road arenas. Places that had never seen a sellout for a women's game were hanging sold out signs outside. Television networks that had never prioritized women's college basketball were scrambling to get the broadcast rights for Iowa games. Advertisers were paying attention. People who had never once in their lives watched a women's basketball game were sitting down in front of their televisions because someone texted them, "You need to see this girl." And when the NCAA tournament came around in 2024, it became something else entirely. The games weren't just games anymore, they were events. Every Iowa tournament game felt like a championship, not because of the stakes, well, yes, because of the stakes, but because the entire country was watching. Because Caitlin Clark was doing things on that stage that made your jaw drop. And because for one magical run, women's college basketball became the most watched thing in American sports. I want you to feel that for a second. The most watched thing in American sports, not just women's sports, all of it. The Iowa LSU Elite 8 game in 2024 drew more viewers than most NBA playoff games, more viewers than most men's college basketball games. It broke records that people thought were unbreakable. And at the center of it, always at the center of it, was Caitlin Clark. She finished her college career as the all-time leading scorer in NCAA history, men's and women's combined, more points than Pete Maravich, more points than anyone who had ever played the game at that level. Let that breathe for a moment. The all-time leading scorer in NCAA history. And then she entered the WNBA draft. The Indiana Fever selected Caitlin Clark with the first overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft. And the moment that happened, the WNBA changed. Now I want to be fair here because this is important. The WNBA was already a great league. There were incredible players, Angel Reese, Aja Wilson, Breena Stewart, Sabrina Ionescu, players of enormous talent and accomplishment who had been grinding in that league for years and deserved every ounce of recognition they got. The WNBA had been building towards something for years, and those players were the foundation. But what Caitlin Clark brought was different. She brought a crossover audience, millions of people who had followed her in college and were now, for the first time, going to tune into the WNBA. The Fever's ticket sales exploded. Games were selling out. Every arena that Indiana visited was packed. Television ratings for WNBA games went to places they had never been before. The jersey sales, the endorsement deals, the social media engagement, all of it went to levels that the league had never experienced. And here's where the story gets complicated. Because when something gets very, very big very, very fast, when the spotlight swings hard in one direction, not everyone is happy about it. Not everyone celebrates the rising tide. Some people see the wave coming and instead of surfing it, they try to block it. And some of the things that happened to Caitlin Clark in her rookie season were not things that happen by accident on a basketball court. Let me walk you through some of the moments, because the details matter here. The details are what turned this from a sports story into something that people felt in their gut. Early in the 2024 WNBA season, Caitlin Clark was playing like you'd expect a rookie to play, adjusting, learning, making mistakes, but also flashing the brilliance that had made her famous. The transition from college to the pros is always hard. The speed is faster. The players are stronger. The schemes are more complex. No rookie comes in and dominates immediately. But Caitlin was doing something that rookies almost never do. She was drawing crowds wherever she went. She was the reason people were buying tickets. She was the reason cameras were pointed at Indiana Fever games for the first time in a long time. And on the court, she was getting hit. Not just physical play, basketball is a physical game, and hard fouls happen. But there were moments that went beyond hard fouls. Moments that made people rewind their DVRs and watch again, slowly, frame by frame, to make sure they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. There was a moment, and this became one of the defining moments of that early season, where Caitlin Clark was shoved to the ground. Hard, Not in the course of a play, not because someone was going for the ball and got tangled up. A deliberate two-handed push that sent her sprawling, the kind of hit that, if it happened on a street, would be called assault. And the crowd went silent for a second, and then the crowd got loud. And the cameras caught the faces of everyone around, players, coaches, officials, and what you saw on those faces told you everything you needed to know, because some faces showed concern, and some faces showed something else, something that looked uncomfortably like satisfaction. Then there was a flagrant foul that drew widespread attention, a forearm to the face, not subtle, not accidental, the kind of contact that officials are trained to identify as intentional. And yes, a flagrant foul was called, but people watching felt like the punishment didn't match the moment, that the response from the league, from commentators, from other players who spoke up about it or didn't speak up, was insufficient. And social media erupted. Because when you have millions of new eyes on a sport, and remember, millions of people were watching the WNBA for the first time because of Caitlin Clark. When all those people tune in and the first thing they see is the player they came to watch getting physically punished, getting pushed and elbowed and fouled hard with what seems like specific intent, those people have questions. Why is this happening? Is this normal? Is someone going to say something? And then Stephen A. Smith said something. Now, if you don't know Stephen A. Smith, and honestly if you've watched ESPN for any period of time in the last 20 years, you know Stephen A. Smith, but just in case, he is the most polarizing, most recognizable, most loudest voice on American sports television. He is the anchor of First Take on ESPN, a show built around debate and hot takes and passionate argument. He has opinions on everything. He shares all of them, loudly, with maximum energy and theatrical delivery that has made him one of the most watched sports personalities in the country. People either love Stephen A. or they find him exhausting, sometimes both at the same time. But here's the thing about Stephen A. Smith that gets overlooked sometimes in all the noise he makes. When he really believes something, when something genuinely bothers him, the performance drops away and what you get is a man who is genuinely, authentically fired up. And you can tell the difference. And when Stephen A. Smith sat down to talk about what was happening to Caitlin Clark, you could tell this was not a performance. This was real. He came out swinging. He talked about the cheap shots. He talked about the moments that had been caught on camera. He called them what they were, cheap shots, not hard basketball, not physical play within the spirit of competition. Cheap shots, deliberate attempts to hurt someone, deliberate attempts to send a message. And he asked the question that a lot of people were asking, but that few people with major platforms were willing to ask out loud. Why? Why is this happening? Why is this specific player getting this specific treatment? And what does it say about the people doing it and the people not speaking up about it? Stephen A. used words like jealousy. He talked about resentment. He talked about the idea that some players in the league were bothered by the attention Caitlin Clark was getting, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was new and she was getting more flowers than players who had been there for years. And he didn't excuse that. He didn't say it was understandable. He called it out as something ugly. And the reaction to Stephen A.'s segment was immediate and enormous. Now, before we go further, I want to make sure we're being fair and complete here, because this is a complicated story and there are multiple perspectives, and understanding all of them is what makes you smarter about it. There were people who pushed back on Stephen A. hard. Some argued that the physical play Caitlin was experiencing was just normal WNBA basketball, that veterans always test rookies, that it's part of how the league works, how every professional league works. You come in, you prove you can take a hit, you earn your place. And they pointed out that other rookies had gone through physical initiation periods without it becoming a national conversation. Some argued that the attention being given to the incidents involving Caitlin Clark was disproportionate because of who she was and how much media coverage she already had, that if it had been a different rookie, no one would have been talking about it. And they had a point, in the sense that media attention is never evenly distributed, and Caitlin Clark was getting an extraordinary amount of coverage. Some argued that there was a racial dimension to the story, that people were quicker to defend Caitlin Clark because she was white, and that black players in the league had been experiencing hard fouls and physical play for years without anyone calling it out on national television. That's a serious argument, and it deserves serious engagement, and we're going to come back to it. Some argued that Stephen A. was himself part of the problem, that his commentary was sensationalized, that it inflamed tensions, that it was irresponsible to use words like jealousy and resentment when talking about players who hadn't spoken publicly about how they felt about Caitlin Clark. And some of those arguments had merit. But here's what was also true, simultaneously. The hits were on tape. You could watch them, not as isolated incidents but as a pattern. And when you watched them, when you really looked, the flagrant foul to the face, the shove to the ground, the elbows that found their way into spaces where elbows don't belong in the normal course of play, it was hard to explain all of it as just normal physical basketball. Hard basketball is hard basketball, cheap shots are cheap shots, and most people who watch the footage when asked to draw that line drew it in the same place. Let me take a step back and give you some context about the history of professional sports and how superstars are treated when they enter leagues. This is not a new story. Stars get tested, that's real. When Michael Jordan came into the NBA, the Detroit Pistons, the bad boys, had specific schemes designed to hit him as hard as they legally could every time he drove to the basket. They wanted to make him think twice. They wanted him to feel it, and they were extraordinarily good at it. Jordan took those hits for years before he finally broke through. When LeBron James came into the league as a teenager, veterans tested him. They hit him. They talked to him. They tried to get inside his head. It's a rite of passage that has existed in professional sports essentially forever. So yes, the argument that rookies get tested is not wrong. But here's where it gets more complicated, and here's where the Caitlin Clark situation is genuinely different in a way worth examining. The testing of Jordan and LeBron was physical, yes, but it existed within a framework where the people testing them still wanted the league to succeed. The Pistons were hard on Jordan because they were trying to beat him in the playoffs, not because they wanted him to leave. The veterans who tested LeBron still recognized that if he flourished, the NBA flourished. With Caitlin Clark, some of the commentary coming from inside the league, and from people adjacent to the league, at times felt less like competition and more like resistance. Less like, we're testing you to see if you belong, and more like, we don't want you to be as big as you're becoming. And that's a fundamentally different thing. Because when you're in a league that has been fighting for decades to get more attention, more resources, more respect, and then attention arrives, real massive cultural attention arrives in the form of a specific player, the right response, the response that serves everyone in the league, is to embrace it, to use it as a platform, to say, this is our moment, let's all rise together. The wrong response is to try to bring the attention getter down. Not everyone in the WNBA had the wrong response. Many players were genuinely welcoming. Many were excited about what Caitlin Clark's presence meant for the league. Many understood that her success was their success. But some didn't, and the ones who didn't made it very obvious on the court. Let's talk about Angel Reese for a moment, because her name was all over this conversation. Angel Reese was one of the most prominent players in the WNBA, a former LSU star, the player who had faced Caitlin Clark in that famous 2023 NCAA championship game when LSU beat Iowa. She was talented, physical, outspoken, and had her own massive following. She was also drafted in 2024 by the Chicago Sky and was Caitlin Clark's contemporary, both of them rookies in the same year, both of them coming from college programs that had been in the national spotlight. Their rivalry in college had been intense. LSU won that championship, and Angel Reese had a famous celebration that became iconic. She did the "you can't see me" gesture in Clark's face, and it became one of the defining images of that year in sports. It was trash talk. It was competition. It was bold, and Angel owned it, and honestly a lot of people respected it. But when they both entered the WNBA, something about their dynamic became a lightning rod. Because here's what happened, the media attention was not equal. Not remotely. Caitlin Clark was getting the majority of the coverage, the endorsement deals, the camera time, the conversation. And Angel Reese, who was also a very good player, who had also been a national star, who also deserved attention, was getting comparatively less. And the question everyone was asking, but in different ways, and with different answers depending on who you asked, was why. Some people said it was simply because Caitlin Clark was the more marketable player, that her shooting style, her college records, her story, her aesthetic, were things that crossed over to audiences that didn't normally watch women's basketball. that it was about individual marketability, not race. Some people said it was absolutely about race, that America had a long and well-documented history of elevating white athletes and undervaluing black athletes, that Angel Reese was every bit as charismatic and talented as Caitlin Clark, but was being filtered through a lens that didn't see her the same way, that the same boldness that got Caitlin Clark called confident was getting Angel Reese called controversial, that the double standard was real and visible, and the people who couldn't see it weren't looking. Both of those perspectives were present in the national conversation. Both have merit, both can be true at the same time. And in the middle of all of this was Caitlin Clark, playing basketball, getting hit, and this is important, not complaining publicly, not going on television and crying foul. She took the hits, got up and kept playing, and there was something in that stoicism, that quiet resilience that made people even more protective of her. Stephen A. Smith's segment on First Take did not exist in a vacuum. He was reacting to specific moments, specific footage, specific conversations that were happening everywhere in sports media. Let me walk you through what the segment felt like, because the energy of it mattered. Stephen A. came in with the kind of controlled intensity that you learn to recognize from him when he's genuinely worked up versus when he's performing. He's always performing to some degree, that's television, that's his brand, that's what he spent decades building. But there are moments when the performance and the real feeling are the same thing, and this was one of those moments. He started by establishing the stakes. He talked about what Caitlin Clark meant not just to Indiana, not just to the WNBA, but to sports in America. He acknowledged that what she had done in college was historic, and what her arrival in the league had meant for viewership and excitement was undeniable. He said it plainly, without hedging, in the way that Stephen A. says things he believes, firmly, looking into the camera, like he's daring someone to disagree. And then he turned to the footage. He talked about the hits. He described them in the language of someone who has watched sports for decades and knows the difference between hard play and targeted aggression. He wasn't talking about normal basketball contact. He was specific about which moments crossed a line, and he explained why they crossed it. And then he said the word that set everything off: jealousy. He said that some of what was happening to Caitlin Clark was rooted in jealousy. That players who had been in the league for years, who had worked hard and earned their place, and deserved more recognition than they had received, were looking at this rookie and seeing all the attention flowing her way and feeling something about it, and that feeling was coming out on the court in the form of physical aggression that had no basketball justification. He wasn't saying those players were bad people. He was saying they were human, and he was saying that being human and having complicated feelings does not give you the right to put someone on the floor. And he was saying that the people around the situation, coaches, officials, league officials, commentators, needed to be honest about what was happening and address it. He said that the WNBA could not allow its biggest star, the person who was driving record-breaking viewership, the person who had done more to put eyes on the league than almost anyone in recent memory, to be physically targeted without the league standing up clearly and protecting her. And then his co-host pushed back a little, and Stephen A. didn't back down even slightly. He doubled down. He got more specific. He named the moments. He talked about the flagrant foul. He talked about the shove. He talked about the culture that allows these things to happen when they're directed at a specific person. And he asked directly, why the WNBA wasn't doing more. The WNBA's response to the situation surrounding Caitlin Clark was, in the view of many observers, insufficient. Flagrant fouls were called in some cases. Fines were issued in some cases, but the sense among many fans, and this is reflected in the numbers, in the social media conversation, in the commentary that poured out in the days following Stephen A.'s segment, was that the league was not treating the targeting of its most visible new player with the urgency that the moment required. And there's a business logic to that too, which is dark but real. The WNBA had a complicated relationship with its own stars. It was an underfunded league, relative to the NBA, that had been fighting for legitimacy for decades. The players who had been there longest were the backbone of the league. You couldn't come in and publicly side with a rookie over veterans without creating problems internally. You couldn't seem to be giving preferential treatment to the newest, most famous person at the expense of the people who had held the league together through the lean years. But you also couldn't allow the player who had done more to grow your audience than anyone in recent memory to get beaten up every time she stepped on the court. It was a lose-lose situation politically, and the league, to many observers, seemed to be trying to thread an impossible needle by saying as little as possible. That silence read as permission to some people, and that's where things got really heated. Let's talk about the broader conversation, because the Caitlin Clark situation didn't just live in sports media, it went way beyond that. It went into politics. It went into culture. It went into conversations about race and gender and media and celebrity, and what America values and who America protects. On one side, you had people who felt that Caitlin Clark was being treated differently, and badly, because her success made other people uncomfortable, that she had earned everything she had, that the attention she was getting was a function of what she had accomplished, and that nobody had the right to take out their frustrations with the unfairness of life on a young woman just trying to play basketball. On the other side, you had people who felt that the outrage on Caitlin Clark's behalf was disproportionate, that she was getting more sympathy and more coverage than black players who had experienced worse, that the people rushing to defend her were motivated, consciously or not, by the fact that she looked a certain way, that the same people who were incensed about a forearm foul against Caitlin Clark had been silent for years about how the league treated its black stars. And here's the hardest and most important thing to say about both of those sides: they were both pointing at something real. The hits on Caitlin Clark were real, the pattern was real, the insufficient response from the league was real, the right to play the game you love without being targeted was real. And the history of American sports media undervaluing black athletes was real. The documented difference in how black and white athletes are described and covered was real. Angel Reese's relative lack of mainstream media coverage compared to Clark was real. These things can coexist, they often do. The world is complicated in exactly this way. Two things can both be true, both be unjust, and both deserve to be addressed. What was unfortunate, and what Stephen A. Smith's segment both reflected and arguably accelerated, was that the conversation often didn't allow for that complexity. It became a binary. You were either defending Caitlin Clark or you were defending the other players. You were either saying the hits were wrong or you were saying she was getting too much attention. The middle ground, where both things are true and both things matter, got drowned out. Now let's get deeper into who some of the other players were in this story, because they're real people with real careers and real feelings, and the narrative that sometimes emerged around them was not always fair. Chennedy Carter was the player who delivered the most talked-about hit on Caitlin Clark. Carter is a guard who had been in the league since 2019. She was talented, genuinely talented, the kind of player who in a different era might have been a household name. But her career had been marked by some off-court and on-court volatility, and she had been traded more than once, and by the time she was with the Chicago Sky in 2024, she was in a complicated place professionally. The hit Carter delivered, it was an off-ball shove that sent Clark sprawling. It didn't happen in the course of a play for the ball. It was deliberate and visible, and it happened right in front of cameras, and there was simply no basketball explanation for it. A flagrant foul was not called initially, and the non-call sparked enormous controversy. Carter in the aftermath was not publicly apologetic. She moved on. Her teammates by and large defended her or stayed silent, and the Chicago Sky's handling of the situation, the organizational response, such as it was widely criticized. What happened to Chennedy Carter afterward in terms of public perception was in some ways a casualty of the environment around this whole situation. She became, in some circles, a villain of the story. And that's not entirely fair, because she's a full person with a career and a story of her own. But actions have consequences, and what she did on that court had consequences. There were other incidents too, moments involving other players. Some were clearly accidental, some were hard to categorize, and a few were, when you watched them carefully, clearly not accidental. And the pattern across those moments, the target being Caitlin Clark repeatedly, game after game, is what made the conversation go where it went. Let me tell you about what it was like to be a fan watching all of this unfold, because I think that perspective sometimes gets lost in the analysis. Imagine you've never watched a WNBA game in your life. You grew up watching March Madness, you saw clips of Caitlin Clark going viral, you watched one game and she hit a shot from 30 feet and you thought, okay, I get it now, and you started following the Indiana Fever. You're new to this, you're excited, You're one of millions of new viewers who have given the league a massive audience. And then you turn on a game and you see the player you came to watch get pushed to the floor, and you ask your buddy who's a longer-time WNBA fan, is that normal? And your buddy is uncomfortable because the answer is complicated. And you watch the replay and no flagrant is called and you think, that looks like it should be a flagrant, and you go online and you're not alone, thousands of people are saying the same thing. And then nothing happens, no statement, no suspension, a fine eventually that is tiny relative to the offense, and then it happens again. And you start feeling like the league that you just decided to invest your attention in doesn't care about protecting its product, and its product is the reason you're there. This is the fan experience that was happening at scale across millions of new viewers, and it mattered, not just emotionally, it mattered for the future of the league, because those viewers had alternatives. They didn't have to stay. The WNBA wasn't their primary sport, it was a new discovery, and new discoveries can be abandoned. The goodwill that Caitlin Clark generated for the league was enormous and fragile at the same time, and the way the league handled the cheap shots had the potential to either solidify that goodwill or fracture it. Stephen A. Smith understood this, and that's part of why his segment hit the way it did. He wasn't just talking about one foul on one play in one game, he was talking about something systemic. He was talking about what the moments, added up, communicated to the millions of people watching. He was saying, if you want this audience to stay, if you want this incredible moment, this generational rise in interest in women's basketball, to become permanent rather than a blip, you cannot allow this player to be targeted and respond with silence and small fines. You have to stand up clearly and say this is not acceptable. And he was saying it in the language he always uses, loud, unambiguous, emotionally direct, which is why some people loved it and some people found it too much. But the underlying point, stripped of the performance, was hard to argue with. The WNBA was at a crossroads, and how it handled Caitlin Clark's treatment in her rookie season would tell the world a great deal about what kind of league it was going to be. Now let's talk about something that doesn't come up enough in this conversation, Caitlin Clark herself, as a person navigating all of this. She was a rookie, 22 years old, newly professional, adjusting to the speed of a new league, the travel, the media attention, the expectations that were astronomical. And on top of all of that, she was being physically targeted in ways that were documented and filmed and debated on national television. And her response was remarkable. She didn't complain publicly, not in the dramatic way that many people might. She acknowledged physical play when asked about it, but she didn't use press conferences to call out individuals or demand the league take action. She kept her focus on basketball, she kept working, she kept showing up and playing. And sometimes she played very well, and sometimes she struggled as rookies do, and sometimes she was clearly feeling the pressure of everything around her situation, but she kept showing up. That's stoicism, and I want to be careful here, because stoicism can sometimes be forced on people when they don't have the option of being anything else, and that's not always admirable, it's sometimes just survival, but the way Caitlin Clark carried herself during that period was noticed by a lot of people, including people who hadn't necessarily been on her side in every debate. Because one thing that was consistently true about Caitlin Clark, across everything that was said about her and done to her in those months, she played basketball, she competed, she adjusted, she grew, and as the season went on there were moments of that Clark brilliance breaking through, a deep three, a no-look pass, a fourth-quarter sequence that reminded everyone why she was there. And the Fever, let's be real, the Fever were not a great team. They were a team in transition, with young players figuring things out. They didn't have a supporting cast that made life easy for their star. So Clark was also doing what young stars on bad teams always have to do, carrying a lot while having limited help. The WNBA, as the season went on, did begin to respond more clearly to some of the situations around Clark. The league implemented some additional enforcement measures. There was increased scrutiny on certain types of fouls. The conversation that Stephen A. and others had amplified seemed to have some effect on how officials were approaching games. But the conversation itself never fully calmed down, because by that point it had become something larger than a basketball story. It had become a test case for how sports media, how sports leagues, how America in general deals with the complicated intersection of race and gender and celebrity and money and fairness. And those are not conversations that resolve quickly. Let's talk about the media's role in all of this, because it's significant and not always flattering. The coverage of Caitlin Clark from the moment she entered the WNBA was extraordinary in scale. Every game she played was analyzed, every statistic was dissected, every moment, positive and negative, was amplified. And the coverage of the other players in the league was not comparable. Angel Reese, as we discussed, was in some ways the most prominent example of this disparity. She was also a rookie, also talented, also a significant personality, but the cameras weren't on her the same way. The endorsement deals weren't matching. The think pieces weren't as numerous. Breena Stewart, one of the best players in the world, multiple championships, multiple MVP awards, continued to be Breena Stewart, excellent and accomplished, but in a media environment that was so focused on Clark that sometimes even Stewart's moments got less airtime than Clark-related controversy. A'ja Wilson, the dominant big of the league, MVP caliber year after year, she was the best player in the league by most metrics, and she was getting a fraction of the mainstream attention that Clark was getting. And these players understandably noticed. Some of them spoke about it publicly, some of them expressed frustration, and their frustration was legitimate. But here's where it gets complicated. None of that was Caitlin Clark's fault. She didn't control which cameras pointed where. She didn't set ESPN's editorial priorities. She didn't decide which players got endorsement deals. She played basketball and the market responded to her the way the market responded. And directing frustration at Clark personally, whether through commentary or through behavior on the court, was misdirecting that frustration. The right target was the media. The right conversation was about structural inequities in sports coverage. The right demand was for more attention for all WNBA players, not less attention for Clark. But frustrated people don't always direct their frustration correctly. That's human. That doesn't make the frustration invalid, it just makes it misdirected. And Stephen A. Smith, to his credit, in his segment did engage with this dynamic. He acknowledged the frustrations of players who had been overlooked. He said explicitly that those players deserved more. He didn't dismiss the structural problems. He just also said very clearly that none of those problems justified what was happening on the court. Let's take a moment to appreciate something that often gets lost in the heat of these debates: what the Caitlin Clark moment meant for women's basketball at the structural level. Before Clark, the WNBA was in a difficult business position. The league had some television deals, but the ratings were modest. Arena attendance was inconsistent. Endorsement money was limited. Players were sometimes having to play overseas during the WNBA off-season just to make ends meet. That's how underpaid they were relative to their talent. The league had been fighting for resources, for respect, for a bigger piece of the sports economy for decades. And the fight was righteous. These were world-class athletes, Olympians, some of the best basketball players on the planet, and they were being compensated and covered as an afterthought. Caitlin Clark changed the economic equation. Not alone, but as a catalyst. The viewership spike she brought translated into leverage. It translated into better television deals. It translated into the league being able to demand more for its product because there was demonstrable, undeniable proof that the product could draw massive audiences. The players who came after Clark, the rookies who would enter the league in 2025 and 2026 and beyond, were going to benefit from the infrastructure that was being built on the back of this moment. Higher salaries, better travel, more media attention, all of it flowing from the window that opened when Caitlin Clark walked into the league and millions of people followed. Understanding this made the arguments about how she was being treated even more painful, because the message that was being sent by some of the treatment, consciously or not, was, "We don't want what you brought," and what she brought was going to help everyone. There's a moment in sports when a player becomes bigger than the game they're playing, when their presence changes the conversation not just about their sport but about something larger, when they stop being an athlete and start being a symbol. Caitlin Clark reached that moment faster than almost anyone in recent sports history. And symbols carry weight that individual people sometimes can't handle. The expectations become impossible. The projections become confusing. Is this about basketball, about gender, about race, about America, about media, about all of it at once? For Caitlin Clark in that first WNBA season, the answer was yes, all of it at once. She walked into a job. She walked into an institution. And she walked into a cultural moment that nobody had fully prepared her for, including the people who ran the league, and the people who covered it, and the people who loved her, and the people who resented her, and the people who were just trying to figure out what it all meant. And she played basketball through all of it. Stephen A. Smith's segment was not the end of the conversation. It was more like a flashpoint, a moment that crystallized everything that had been building and shot it out into the broadest possible conversation. In the days after the segment aired, everybody was talking about it. Not just sports people, everybody. Your aunt who doesn't watch basketball was talking about it. Politicians were talking about it. Celebrities were talking about it. People who had barely heard of the WNBA 6 months earlier were now deeply invested in this specific debate. And the conversations were everywhere, and they were passionate, and they were often more heat than light, but they were happening, and that mattered. Because conversations are how things change, not immediately, not cleanly, not without pain, but they're how it starts. The conversation about protecting WNBA players from targeted aggression, the conversation about media equity in women's sports, the conversation about how leagues handle the politics of veteran versus newcomer, the conversation about what happens when the market lifts one player above others, and what that means for team sports and collective well-being. All of those conversations were accelerated by what happened, and some of them, in the months that followed, started producing results. Not enough results, not for everyone, not quickly enough, but results. Let me tell you what happened to Caitlin Clark as the season went on. She kept playing, she kept adjusting. She started to find her footing more consistently as the year progressed. The Fever weren't contenders, but they were more competitive than people expected. Clark's numbers improved as the season moved forward. The flashes of brilliance became more frequent. And the hits kept coming for a while, but there was a sense gradually that the league was watching more carefully, that the tolerance for targeting had diminished, that the conversation Stephen A. and others had forced had made some difference. Clark's rookie season was not the triumphant coronation that some had projected. Rookies rarely have those, and the projections around Clark were unfairly astronomical. But it was a remarkable beginning. It was the start of something, and the people who watched it carefully knew they were watching a player who was going to be in the league for a long time, who was going to keep getting better, and who was going to remain a central figure in women's basketball for the foreseeable future. The rookie year was complicated, and painful and historic and controversial and incredibly exciting, sometimes all in the same game. Which sounds, honestly, like a lot of the great rookie years in sports history. Now let's zoom out one more time, because I want to make sure we've captured the full significance of this moment. What Stephen A. Smith said on First Take about cheap shots on Caitlin Clark wasn't just sports commentary. It was a moment that reflected everything the WNBA was going through in real time, the tension between its past and its future, between its established stars and its new arrival, between the audience it had always had and the massive new audience that had arrived. And it reflected something about American sports culture and American culture in general, about how we handle the arrival of something new and enormous, about how institutions respond to disruption, about how individuals navigate moments that are bigger than they prepared for. Stephen A. was loud about it, characteristically, inescapably loud, and some people think he was too loud, and some people think the loudness was exactly right. But he wasn't wrong. The cheap shots were real, the targeting was real, the insufficient response was real, and the stakes for Caitlin Clark, for the Fever, for the WNBA, for the millions of new fans who were tuning in were very, very real. And calling it out loudly on the biggest sports platform in the country forced a reckoning that might not have happened otherwise, or might have happened more slowly, or might have been buried under quieter, more diplomatic language that let the league off the hook. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is also the most necessary voice in the room. Let's talk about the lasting legacy of all this, because that's ultimately what matters most. Women's basketball in America changed in 2024. Not because of Stephen A.'s segment, not because of any single moment, but because of an accumulation of things, of which the Caitlin Clark controversy was an enormous part. More people watch the WNBA now than ever before. That's documented, the numbers don't lie. More people know the names of WNBA players now than ever before. Not just Clark's name, other players too. Because the spotlight that Clark brought illuminated the whole stage, and people who came to see her ended up discovering Breena Stewart and Aja Wilson and Angel Reese and others. The economic situation of the league improved, contract negotiations happened with more leverage, the business got better. And the conversation about how women athletes are treated, on the court, in the media, in the endorsement space, got bigger and louder and more mainstream than it had been before. None of that means everything is fixed. None of that means the structural problems are solved. The fight for equity in women's sports is ongoing and will be ongoing for the foreseeable future. But something shifted, and the Caitlin Clark moment, including the controversy and the cheap shots and Stephen A's reaction and all of it, was part of what shifted it. Here's something I want you to think about. Every generation has a player who arrives and forces sports, the institutions, the media, the culture, to reckon with something it wasn't ready to reckon with. In the NBA, it was Magic and Bird forcing the league to reckon with its marketability, then Jordan forcing it to reckon with what a global superstar could be, then LeBron forcing it to reckon with player empowerment and athletes as public intellectuals. In women's basketball, there have been players who pushed the door open, Lisa Leslie, Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, Candice Parker, each one made the space bigger for the next. And then Caitlin Clark arrived and kicked the door off the hinges. Not alone, not in a vacuum, standing on the shoulders of every player who had come before, but arriving at a specific cultural moment when the technology, the media landscape, the social platforms, the appetite for women's sports, all lined up in a way that allowed something unprecedented to happen. And the world wasn't ready, the league wasn't ready, the players weren't ready, the media wasn't ready, nobody was fully ready for how big it got, how fast. And when you're not ready, you sometimes make mistakes. Sometimes institutions fail to respond appropriately. Sometimes individuals do things out of emotion or frustration that they wouldn't do if they had more space to think. And sometimes a very loud man on television sits down and says, "Hold on, let's talk about what's actually happening here." And sometimes that's exactly what the moment needs. There's one more thing I want to address before we bring this to a close, and it's the thing that sits underneath all of this, and that makes it genuinely hard and genuinely important. The question of who deserves to be seen. The WNBA players who had been grinding in that league for years, before Clark, before the cameras, before the sellout crowds, they deserved to be seen. They played excellent basketball in front of modest crowds and modest television audiences and modest financial reward, and they did it because they loved the game and because they believed in what they were building. They deserved more than they got. Caitlin Clark, arriving as a rookie, drew more cameras and crowds and attention than veterans who had given the league their careers. That's not fair. That's the market being the market. The market is not moral, it just responds, but the unfairness of it was real and felt. And the challenge, the one the league, the media, the culture all faced in 2024 and continues to face, is how to hold both things at once. How to celebrate what Clark brought to the league without erasing the people who were there before. How to address the inequities in coverage without tearing down the phenomenon that could fix some of those inequities. How to protect the new star without implying that the veterans don't also deserve protection. It's complicated, it's genuinely hard, and anyone who tells you it's simple is either not thinking carefully enough or is selling something. Stephen A. Smith didn't have all the answers. He had a perspective and he shared it at maximum volume, and it sparked a conversation that needed to be had. But the conversation is bigger than his segment, bigger than any one take. It's about what we value, who we see, who we protect, and who we're building this thing for. So where does it all leave us? Caitlin Clark is in the WNBA. She's going to be there for a long time. She's going to keep getting better. The Fever are going to keep building around her. And the audiences she brought are, by and large, still there, watching, following, learning the names of other players, becoming real fans of the league rather than just fans of a phenomenon. The players who targeted her, most of them have moved on from it publicly. The league has continued to evolve in how it handles physical play. The conversation about media equity in women's sports continues and has grown. And Stephen A. Smith, he's still on first take, still loud, still generating more reaction per segment than almost anyone in sports media. His take on the Caitlin Clark situation stands as one of the moments that defined his 2024, a moment when he used his platform to say something that genuinely needed saying, in a way that only he can say it. Not everyone agreed with him. Not everyone is supposed to agree with Stephen A. Smith. That's almost never the point. The point is the conversation. The point is that something happened on basketball courts in America in 2024 that needed to be talked about, and it got talked about. Loudly, publicly, in ways that mattered. And Caitlin Clark kept playing basketball. The best way to end this story, I think, is to go back to the beginning of it. Not the beginning of the controversy, but the beginning of Caitlin Clark. A kid in West Des Moines, Iowa, playing basketball in the driveway, in the gym, in the high school arena, shooting from distances that seemed too far to be serious, making her teammates laugh because the ball kept going in anyway, learning to love the game the way you love something when it gives you back everything you put into it. She didn't know then that she'd become a symbol. She didn't know that her presence in a professional league would spark national debates that had nothing to do with basketball and everything to do with America. She didn't know that millions of people would watch her get pushed to the floor on national television, and that a man on ESPN would talk about it for 20 minutes in a segment that people would replay and debate for months. She just loved basketball. And basketball loved her back, even when the people around basketball didn't always. And she kept playing. That's the part that sticks with me honestly. Not the controversy, not the segment, not the takes and the counter-takes and the cable news chyrons. The part that sticks with me is that through all of it, through the targeting and the debate and the microscope, and the expectations that no human being could have fully met, she kept showing up and playing basketball. Because that's who she is, and that's what she loves. And that's the story that everything else was orbiting around. A girl from Iowa who could shoot from anywhere. Who came to the big league and changed it. And who, when it got hard, and it got hard, kept playing. Thank you for spending this time with this story. Because it's a story that matters not just for basketball fans, not just for people who care about the WNBA. It matters for anyone who thinks about fairness and attention, and what we owe to each other in competitive spaces, and how institutions respond to disruption, and what it looks like when someone genuinely special arrives on a stage, and the stage has complicated feelings about it. These are real questions, they don't have easy answers, but asking them loudly, publicly, with honesty and with the willingness to hold complexity is how we make things better. Stephen A. Smith asked them loudly. Caitlin Clark answered them quietly, on the court with every game she played. And the WNBA and women's basketball and American sports culture is different because of both of them.